Hey guys. So today we are starting on chapter 12. We're going to read chapter 12 and 13. So the last thing that we went over, it's in the middle of the war, and Nate has unofficially joined the American Army because he met his friend Paul, and he's now staying at that camp with Paul. He kind of doesn't have a choice. He has nowhere else to go. But so they're kind of, I don't want to say training him because he's 11 years old and he's not supposed to be fighting a war till you're 14. But he is helping out around the fort and stuff at the place where the soldiers are at. Okay? So we're at on chapter 12. By the second week of August, there were about 20,000 American soldiers in the camps in and around New York City, with more arriving every day. The Americans had built 10 big forts on Manhattan Island and 6 more across the river in Brooklyn. Each fort had a rough building surrounded by tall dirt and stone walls and deep trenches. The walls were topped with cannons. The men felt ready for battle, but still the British didn't attack. Rumors swirled. They'd heard about a new kind of cannonball called a shell. It exploded when it hit the ground. Spies reported that there were now more than 430 British ships anchored nearby in Staten Island, and at least 40,000 soldiers. And not all of them were redcoats. King George had hired 8,000 German soldiers to fight alongside the British. These people were known as, do y'all remember? Hessians. The men whispered the word Hessians like it was a curse. The men whispered the word. They were professional killers from Germany, Paul explained. Hessians were famous around the world for their dark green and red uniforms and their pointed silver hats and their thick black mustaches and their thirst for blood. They began training when they were 5 years old. They fought mostly with their boyets, which were twice as long as the one British used. So here were the soldiers in the war. This is pretty cool. So you've got an American drummer boy. This is the picture it shows. And I'm sure you want to see that, not my no makeup face. An American soldier. You've got an American officer, so just a higher rank. I guess this is the way that they ranked. I would imagine as like this would be Nate, Paul, and like George Washington. You know, like that would be the ranking. And then this side is those that fought on the British side. This would be the British drummer boy. You can kind of tell the difference in those drummer boy. I think the British has a lot more put together. The British soldier versus the American soldier. They're a lot more put together, the British are, than the British officer. I'm sorry, the Hessian. This is the Hessian, which is the German. Oh. I think the German looks like a weird hat. Okay. So on the British side, you've got the British and the Hessians are fighting with them, and then you got the Americans on the other side. The Americans, of course, hired like those slaves to help them. Nate couldn't tell if the stories were completely true. He thought of the legends Papa and the men used to tell about giant squid and whales that swallowed ships. The Hessians sounded more like storybook monsters than real-life soldiers. But there were no mistaking the fear in the men's eyes. There was something even more dangerous than Hessians, and it was lurking right around in the camp. Nate discovered it on a boiling afternoon. The men were on a marching drill, and Nate was alone in the camp doing his chores. The weather was beastly hot. The sun beat down. Mosquitoes attacked them at night. And the usual camp smells turned into unbearable stink. The most stomach-turning odors rose up from the open latrine pits where the man and Nate and all did all their private business, like pooping. Some days Nate felt like his nose would just burn right off from the smell. Nate was taking a break from chopping wood, and he took a swig from the canteen James had given him. And then he heard a strange sound like an animal was crying out in pain. Nate looking around thinking it was one of the cats that chased rats around the camp. He heard the sound again, and he realized it was coming from inside one of the tents. It was James's tent. Nate remembered that James had been ill yesterday, and there were always gut sickness and fever swamping around the camp, so Nate figured James had one of them. Nate stood outside the tent. "James," he said, "it's Nate. You all right?" Silence. More moaning. Nate's heart pounded as he stuck his head through the tent flap, and then he lurched back in horror. There was someone on the ground. It had to be James, except it didn't look like James or even a human being. Hundreds and hundreds of hideous blisters boiled all over his face, his arms and chest covered too. It was smallpox, the most dreaded disease of all. And it was the disease that stole Nate's mama all those years ago, and it almost killed Nate too. Nate pushed away his fear and disgust, and he went inside and knelt next to James, and he took James's hand, and oh, it was burning hot. "James," Nate said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Go away," James rasped. "You're going to get sick." "I had it already," Nate said, taking the young man's hand. "Having smallpox once, if it didn't already kill you, meant you couldn't get it again. It was like chickenpox. Almost half of the people who got the disease would die. Some came through, but were badly scarred. Eliza had scars," remember the slave, "had scars on her cheeks. Theo had them all over his back. Nate didn't need a doctor to tell him that James was dying. He said a prayer, and then he rushed to find help. He returned with Paul and Martin, who were both safe from smallpox. Nate helped them bring James to the hospital, and James died that night. Captain Marsh led a service for him, and all the men shed tears for that kind and generous man. The weeks ticked by, and Nate became more and more restless. He worried that other men would get sick, and he kept thinking of Papa, and he missed Eliza and Theo. These thoughts weighed down on him like rocks in his pockets. The mood in the camp grew darker, and then one afternoon of August 21st, the sky suddenly turned black. The New York City was slammed by a thunderstorm, more violent than any storm, than even the storm that took Papa. Rain poured down. The howling wind ripped apart tents and knocked over trees and sent barrels flying through the air. But the most terrifying was the lightning. Blinding bolts stabbed down like Hessian Boyers. At a camp near to the river, 10 soldiers were struck dead by a single bolt of lightning. 3 other soldiers were hit as they were running along the street. The lightning killed the men and melted in the coins in their pockets. Nate lay awake all night as the storm raged. He had a feeling that the furious wind was screaming out a warning, and it was. The next morning, word came that the British were on the move. Thousands of British soldiers had landed on Brooklyn, just across the East River from New York City. The British attack was about to begin. This is chapter 13. It says August 25th, 1776, 10 a.m. in Brooklyn. 3 days later, at Connecticut 5th was ordered to Brooklyn along with 6,000 other soldiers. They were all ferried across the East River by big rowboats. Nate and the men were sent to Fort Greene, one of the 6 Brooklyn forts. All the forts were spread across Brooklyn Heights. That was part of Brooklyn that was closest to New York City. Nate hadn't realized how big the Brooklyn was. It had been at least 10 times the size of New York City, and much of the land was wild. Only a few hundred people actually lived in Brooklyn, and most had just fled there. But this wild land was important in the war. If the British took Brooklyn, they would put their cannons on Brooklyn Heights, and from there they would blast New York to bits and pieces. But we're not going to let this happen, Captain Marsh said. It was a few hours after they arrived at Fort Greene, and Nate and all of the men had set up their tents inside the fort's tall dirt walls. Now Captain Marsh was explaining the American battle plan. He showed them a map of Brooklyn and pointed out the 6 American forts. Then Captain Marsh pointed out the squiggly line on the map. It looked to be about 1 mile from Brooklyn Heights. "That's the Guadas Heights," he said. It was a long ridge of hills. "The British are somewhere on the other side of the ridge, and they have to cross the hills of Guadas Heights to get to our fort. But we already have 3,000 men guarding those hills. So when the British try to cross," Paul chimed in, "we'll blast them right back to England." Captain Marsh cracked a tiny smile, or at least back to Staten Island. The Redcoats and the Hessians who made it to the forts would face dozens of cannons. Thousands of Americans would be shooting at them from the trenches, protected by the tall dirt walls. "It would be like Bunker Hill," Samuel said with a hopeful smile. "That's right," Captain Marsh said. the certainty gleaming in his eyes, and the men cheered. So this is the picture. It's hard to see, the light in here is kind of bad, of where like their map was. The Brooklyn Heights was here, and that's where they were. The Fort Greene was right there. So they couldn't let them up there, because if they were up here, they would set up cannons and they could blast New York right there across the river. Several nights passed, and Brooklyn stayed mostly quiet. On the night of August 26th, soldiers came from different companies gathered around the campfires. They roasted hunks of pork on sharpened sticks, and they insulted the British and called the Hessians foul names Nate would never repeat. To Nate, it almost seemed like the men were looking forward to a big party, not a bloody battle. They sang songs, including one that Nate had never heard before. It had a bright and catchy tune, but the words made no sense at all. It was like, Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. One man played along on a little twinkling flute called a fly. Paul, Martin, and Samuel just sang along to that crazy song. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. What's it? Yankee Doodle? Nate asked, raising his voice up over the singing and knee slapping. It's what the British call us, Martin said. They say the Americans are a bunch of Yankee Doodles, country folks who don't know how to fight. The British make up this song to tease us in battle, Paul added. So why are we singing it? Nate asked. This made no sense at all. Because at Bunker Hill, we showed them what a bunch of Yankee Doodles can do, Samuel said. So we stole the name and the song. Nate smiled. Now we got it. The Americans took the British insult and turned it into a battle song. The singing went on until a blaring trumpet called the men to attention. 3 men appeared. The man in the center was very tall and wore a blue uniform. The men leaped to their feet. It was General Washington. We know him. The general stood quiet for a moment, and the men gathered around him. A hush came over the camp. Even the grumpiest and sleepiest of men stood straight up. They brushed the dust from their shirts and straightened up their caps, and Nate stood extra tall. The moment has come, General Washington began. The enemy has landed, and now the honor and success of America depends on you. His voice was calm but powerful. He told them that a great battle was coming, and he reminded the men what they were fighting for: freedom for their new country. The world will soon learn what few brave men fighting for their land can do. His words seemed to raise up in the air, and Nate knew he'd never forget the sound of the general's voice. Most of all, Nate would remember the feeling of being almost lifted up off the ground by nothing more than words. General Washington didn't speak for long, but even hours later, his voice seemed to echo through the camp. After the general left, the men settled down in their tents. Nate quickly fell asleep. Just after dawn, the sound of American alarm cannons boomed through the fort. Paul poked his head into Nate's tent. His eyes were flashing with excitement. The British were trying to cross Agulhas Heights. The Battle of Brooklyn was about to begin. This is chapter 14. I'm excited. This is August 27th at 9 a.m. in Brooklyn, New York. The men of the Connecticut 5th were ordered to help guard the Agulhas Heights. Days before, Captain Marsh had told Nate that he would stay inside the fort for as long as they were in Brooklyn. You're not a soldier, Nate, he said. I don't want you on that battlefield. But that morning, 22 men of the Connecticut 5th were too sick to march. There were not enough men to carry ammunition and the other supplies to the ridge. Nate, the captain said, I need you to march with us to the camp, and then you will return here to the fort. They were taking the place of some Pennsylvania soldiers who had been on duty there for 3 days straight. You'll march back here with the Pennsylvania men. Yes, sir, Nate said. Anything happens, we'll all get ourselves back to the fort, you hear? Yes, sir. Gruesome pictures flashed through Nate's mind as he thought of stepping out of the fort. Exploding cannonballs, gun-smashing musket balls, beignets dripping with blood. But a rush of pride swept Nate's fears away. Captain Marsh was counting on Nate. Paul helped Nate load up a large knapsack with extra ammunition cartridges. He was unusually quiet. He didn't like the idea of Nate leaving the fort. You follow me, Paul said as we were lining up. And stay close, Nate nodded. He took a place in line between Paul and Samuel, and they all set out in the wilds of Brooklyn. They marched along the narrow road under a sunny sky, and the road cut through fields and meadows. They passed a deserted farm. The house was boarded up, and there was not a person or animal in sight. In the yard, there was a big tree with a wooden swing hanging from the branch. Nate could imagine Theo shrieking happily as he flew up and down. Nate felt the familiar ache of missing Theo. He was also thought about the family that had to build up that farm. Where had that family gone? Would they ever be able to come back to their home? For the first time, it really hit Nate. This war wasn't just about King George and his soldiers on the battlefield. Regular people might lose their home. Others would lose far more. Their family members and their friends. And even if the Americans did win, some people would never get back to what they had lost. The road took them up a hill, and soon they were in the woods. They had to reach the Guanas Heights. There were a group of American soldiers standing guard along the way, but not as many as Nate would have expected. They turned off the road and walked along the ridge. The thickening woods had made it hard to see more than just a few yards ahead, and it was very quiet. And then, boom, boom, 2 sharp cannon blasts shook the ground. Nate froze. Samuel whipped around. "That's strange," he said. His eyes narrowed with worry. Those cannons were shot from this side of the ridge. Samuel scanned the woods. "The Americans don't have big cannons this far from the forts. The British aren't supposed to be anywhere near here." But they were. And they had the high ground. Crack, 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 crack. Musket fires blasted them from the hill just above. A ball streaked right by Nate's ear. Looking up, Nate saw splashes of red between the trees up on the hill. "Redcoats, take cover!" Captain Marsh shouted. Nate threw himself down in the dirt and covered his head with his hands. More shots exploded. Crack, crack, hiss! Samuel cried out, and Nate peeked up just in time to see him crumpling to his knees. Samuel's hands flew up to his chest and blood gushed from between his fingers, and Nate saw it all so clearly, but he couldn't believe it was even happening. All he could do was think, no, 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 no. The life drained from Samuel's face. His body seemed to melt to the ground. Nate sprang up and rushed for Samuel, but the redcoats were shooting again. Crack, hiss! Nate dove back behind the tree, and Captain Marsh's voice shouted orders. "Prepare!" The Connecticut 5th men aimed their muskets. Crack, 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 crack. And then they dropped to their knees and reloaded exactly as they had practiced in their drills. But this was not a drill. Nate shook himself out of the shock, and Samuel's musket was lying on the ground, and he spent hours teaching Nate how to use it. And now Nate knew what Samuel would expect him to do. Nate grabbed that musket. The wooden handle was still warm from Samuel's hands. I don't want to stop, but we're going to stop for the day. So next, I want you to think about all that we just read. We just read a whole lot. We just read a big part of the battle, the start of the battle. What's next? Okay, so go ahead and go answer your questions for this and tune back in tomorrow. Let's read. Bye, guys.